Welcome to In Progress, everybody. It's our weekly roundtable discussion of the political stories and issues and ideas that are top of mind for progressive folks across the Lone Star State again this week. My name is Chris Mosier. I'm the communications director here at Progress, Texas. Welcome if you're hearing us on the radio, especially in Great Big Old Houston, Texas on KPFT FM 90.1. Progress, Texas amplifies progressive values, leaders, and actions, and we operate a major digital network, including social media, podcasts, legacy media contributions, and more. We reach millions of people across Texas every month. This week, joined by Executive Director Kathleen Thompson. Hi, KT.
Hey, folks.
And our digital manager, Haley Smith. Hi, Haley Smith.
Howdy, howdy.
So glad to see you guys. Tatum Owens is normally with us, is almost always with us. In fact, it's kind of strange that she's not here. Tatum is hard at work behind the scenes, getting us ready to head for Corpus Christi. By the time you hear this, we will be either on the road or there, starting with some happy hour fun that we're doing with the Texas Progressive Caucus on Thursday evening. And then, of course, we will be as close to broadcasting live as we can get from the Texas Democratic Party convention in Corpus Christi. That's happening pretty much through the day on Friday and Saturday. If you are planning to be at the convention, which a great many of you listening to this will be, once again, open invitation. Please do come by and see us. Going to be hanging out and meeting folks and having a good old time. So we want to talk about the convention. And, you know, I kind of think as progressive people, if not necessarily as Democrats, what we would like to see happen at the convention, what questions we might have for people who will be at the convention in terms of candidates or lawmakers or whoever might be there, and what kind of effect all of this, all of our best wishes might have on Texas and on the country coming out of the election if things, you know, roll through November with some success for the Democrats. I do want to talk about some polling real quick, and it turns out this is not a really big surprise, or some of it's a surprise maybe, that James Tallarico and Ken Paxton, the Democratic and Republican nominees for the U.S. Senate, respectively, are very much in a dead heat. They are 1 point apart in a poll with about a 3.5 point margin of error. They are very much neck and neck. It is a complete toss-up at this point. It's going to totally depend on turnout at this point for that race, is what it appears to me. Starting with you, Haley, do you have any opinions about how close neck and neck that might be? Are you surprised? What are your feelings as we get these new polling numbers?
Well, I feel like every poll that's released, it has like the point margin of error or whatever. And it, like, in my head, it's so much bigger than it actually is. I think this is like a 3.5% margin of error, but like in Texas, that might as well be a million points, you know? Yeah. We're just so far away to November that trying to predict or poll anything seems like a dream, but his performance like in independence is not necessarily surprising, but it's giving me hope. I think that there are a large chunk of people that are willing to be more fluid between the parties that a lot of people who are outside of Texas don't really understand. Like, of course, the Texas Republicans are going to be kind of hardline, but like there's plenty of people to still convince in this race. And I think that's what Tallarico's doing.
Let me spell that out. I didn't quite get to that in the open there, that independents. Well, let me back up. Republicans, 80 some odd percent going for Paxton. They're on Team Paxton, is what it is. Democrats, 88%, something like that, a little bit more, dedicated to voting for James Tallarico. Same thing. Team sport is what it is. The big story here is independent voters, where it's a 40% favorability to Tallarico and a 12% favorability towards Paxton among independent voters. In other words, people who don't consider themselves either a Democrat or a Republican. The people I hang around with, most of the people that I hang around with are progressive-minded sort of people, but they're less likely to come right out and say, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. Just a lot of the people that I know are these independent voters. So my, personal anecdotal experience, I feel like there's a lot of these people out there. So Kathleen, my question to you becomes, what is the strategy, going into Corpus Christi in the Democratic convention? Clearly the convention is about firing up the loyalists and firing up the base. We've learned something very, very significant about independent voters. How does that change the calculus going into and coming out of Corpus Christi?
So the convention is for those very committed precinct chairs, county party chairs, club leaders, PAC leaders. So it will be a little bit of preaching to the choir. But as Chair Kendall Scudder told us earlier this week, and just a few clicks back in your feed, y'all go back and have a listen on your drive or flight to Corpus. This is the one for all the marbles. They're just going to be trainings that like they haven't had before. There are going to be opportunities to reach out to your community like never before. And I'm excited that people will leave convention with the tools they need to win in November. And I think the calculus is reaching those independent voters who cannot hold their nose and vote for Ken Paxton. You'd have to be living under a rock to not know who he is and what he is, and about his indictments by his fellow Republicans in the Texas House of Representatives, the Republicans who wanted to vote to convict him, in the Senate. Where would you have to be to not know that his own staff members turned him over to the FBI?
Yeah.
I mean, just hit after hit after hit. I say all that, but maybe there are people in your life who don't know. I attended Ken Paxton's arraignment in Collin County way back when. The state party actually invited me, and I went because there was a small protest saying, like, look at what's happened to this guy. Look at what he's doing. You don't want to be a part of that. And a woman came up to me. I dress a little conservatively. She probably saw an ally in me, and she said, "What is happening?" And I said, "It's Ken Paxton's arraignment, and he's going to be booked today." What? What do you mean? And I'm like, "Ma'am, this is on the cover of every newspaper.
Yeah.
Dallas Morning News, Fort Worth Star Telegram. What newspaper do you read?" I don't read the newspapers.
Yeah.
And it's on the evening news, CBS, NBC. What news program do you watch at night? I don't watch the news.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe there are people who don't know, but this is a great opportunity to talk to independents in your life who maybe have not been as keyed in, and let them know about the just corruption and chaos and really just off the cliff priorities of Ken Paxton versus what James Talarico has to offer. And then Talarico cannot ignore his base. We saw how successful lighting $81 million on fire was in 2024 with cable TV ads and direct mail, but not going and doing the work and doing that retail politics to motivate the base at community centers and at churches. And you want to turn out all those people, and assuming that the base is going to show up for you can lead us to just a backsliding that we haven't seen before. And that calculus has to be both. It has to be both independence and base.
I want to be pretty clear about what Kathleen is talking about. We're talking about Colin Allred and his last campaign for the Senate against Ted Cruz. We noted a lot of money spent on legacy media. We noted, frankly, a lack of cooperation from our invitations to have Mr. Allred on our airwaves. He never showed up during that campaign, and he did not win. He did quite a bit worse than Beto had done in the last shot at Ted Cruz six years prior. So just is what it is. And of course, we wish Colin Allred all the best in his current congressional run. But we do hope that current candidates will notice that hitting the streets and taking every available avenue, especially, a podcast network like Progress Texas, is a pretty good way and a pretty affordable way to get your messages out there to a bunch of people who want to hear those messages. So let's just be perfectly clear about that.
Thanks.
I do want to talk about, let's return to those independent voters that we want to convince. A lot of them are turned off by negative politics. A lot of them may initially have a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to anyone coming at them about how horrible Ken Paxton is with just a tune-out. Just, I don't want to hear negative politics, and they just won't listen to it. I think it might be an equally compelling argument to put out there, what sort of improvements could we see in our lives at a national level, at a state level, even at a local level? With the changing of the guard, Texas has been under Republican rule for 30 years. We have a lot of problems that when you've had the same boss for 30 years, the boss has to take some credit for the problems. We got environmental problems. We got all sorts of problems with our public school systems, much of which is self-inflicted to a large degree. All sorts of problems. Anything that really is happening on a systematic or systemic sort of level across the state of Texas, you got to blame the boss. And for 30 years, the boss has been the Republican Party. And so let's start here. Really, the marquee thing here is James Talarico versus Ken Paxton. Haley, would you thought experiment for us here for a second and envision what happens? And I'll go a little bit further here. James Talarico wins the Senate, and the Democrats actually manage to dominate the majority in the Senate, by that operation. Let's go ahead and go full optimistic there. What happens if Talarico and the Democrats are suddenly in control of the U.S. Senate?
Wow. I throw a really big party and invite all my friends. Something, and you were talking about you have to calculate not just who you need to convince, but who already support you. And something, especially I think for younger voters, that it's almost hard to imagine is like, we're told so much that like this is the most important election because of what it can take away. But especially young people aren't really familiar with the idea of this is what politics can give you. This is what it's like to have somebody in office who can make your life better, make your life easier. So we're not just going to fix public education. We're going to make it better. We're going to have free lunch for kids. We're not just going to fix healthcare. We're the least insured state in the country. We're going to make healthcare better. We're going to make sure that people can actually go and get preventative care. Hell, what about public transportation? That's something I don't hear people talk about a lot. Maybe if we had people in office that, a majority of people in office that wanted to make people's lives easier, we'd have like trains.
Right.
Imagine how cool that would be.
Federal funding coming from the U.S. government is something that could definitely happen. If we've got a Texas senator who's a Democrat who wants to get these things done, a lot more likely that those things come to fruition for sure.
If we have $300 billion for Iran, can we get some money here in Texas?
Yeah.
I've mentioned this before on some of the podcasts, but my grandparents were stationed at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi. And after Katrina, I saw all over the Gulf Coast bumper stickers that said F and the whole word Iraq, rebuild the Gulf Coast. So we've got billions of dollars for war that gets us nowhere and millions of dollars for a reflecting pool. We have money to invest in our own people and not about enriching the wealthiest Americans who are well connected to either Governor Greg Abbott or Ken Paxton or Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick.
Right. Just the basic mechanics of the Senate would change fundamentally. There'd be, first of all, a full stop on any crazy MAGA legislation that tries to make its way through the U.S. Congress. That would come to a complete and total stop for a couple of years at least, which would be really nice. You would see also, the Senate is where the judicial nominations and confirmations happen. So this overrunning of our court system by MAGA types, courtesy of Donald Trump, would come to a halt for a little while. And, I think even some of the current senators, and I won't name any names, have kind of tried to downplay the idea of further impeachments of Donald Trump. But once the Democrats, should they gain control of the Senate, that's when impeachments become a real thing. That's when impeachments are no longer about theater or about partisan hyperbole. That's when they become an actual, legal mechanism that could end up with a changing of someone out of an office. There are many, many different things that could happen at that level. Let's shift down the pecking order here and talk about the governor's race. Gina Hinojosa, who, by the way, in all my years of living in Texas and being surrounded by people speaking Spanish and speaking in Spanish tones and speaking by, Spanish dialect rules, I never knew that the H in Hinojosa is completely silent. Did you guys know that?
Yes.
No.
I didn't know that it's not Hinojosa, it's Hinojosa. I didn't know that until just the other day. In fact, at our 16th anniversary party in Dallas, someone said, "Hey man, you're saying it wrong." And I confirmed that. So I'm getting it right now. But Kathleen, you go first on this one. Suddenly we have a Democratic governor of Texas, the first one since Ann Richards. What changes in the lives of everyday Texans at that point?
Immediately she fires the Texas Education Commissioner and replaces him with someone who's actually an educator. Can you imagine? And that we give our school districts back to the local communities that should be leading them and not well-connected cronies. I'm really pleased that Gina is leaning hard into public policy issues that cross party lines. I was pleased to attend her public education roundtable in Grapevine for my home school district 2 weeks ago yesterday. And I sat across the way from a very devout Republican mom, and I'm a very progressive mom sitting right across from her. And the future of our kids' schools, which are the hubs of our communities, have been defunded and defunded and defunded. And money that's supposed to go into education from the Robin Hood school funding scheme goes into the general fund.
Right.
And then, all this voucher money that goes to wealthy Texans. And public schools are closing. They're going to 4-day school weeks. And how is a kid going to make up that lost curriculum time? The buses aren't running because the school districts can't afford it. So that means kids are getting hurt in accidents and walking home. And there's just a chain reaction of events from having Greg Abbott in office for all this time. He's the longest serving governor in all of the U.S. And at the roundtable, I spoke with the rep and her team about, like, there's no dots to connect. It's not Always Sunny in Philadelphia with a corkboard and red lines everywhere. It's one line. It's Greg Abbott here, Greg Abbott here. And replacing Greg Abbott with a pro-public education, pro-healthcare, pro-democracy mom would really change the way Texas government works, even if that were the only seat that flipped. And I don't think that will be what happens. But even if she were the only one, I think that it would be a remarkable shift in the tone and the public policy priorities that come out of the legislature. And I think we would have other moderating effects, just like we did in 2018 when the Democrats didn't take the House, they didn't take the Senate. But what a great public education session we had, because people saw the writing on the wall and said, if I don't vote for this wildly popular pro-public education bill, I might lose my seat. So returning some fear to these longtime electeds, a fear of the people would be a really healthy measure. And I'm so pleased to see down ballot candidates really focusing on key public issues where you can cross party lines, because the issue should cross party lines.
So the Texas governor is less powerful than a lot of other state governors. There's a plural executive. They can't do a lot of things that a lot of people would think that they could. But the one thing that sticks out to me, and maybe it shouldn't, but it does, is the veto power.
Sure.
Imagine if we had a session where Republicans are doing what they do and throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, but we have somebody in office that can say,
Nope.
no, this isn't actually in the best interest, you know?
Yeah.
Like, imagine, it'd be so much less scary. Like,
well, it would just be, as Kathleen mentioned, it would just be kind of a chilling effect, if you will, on people, doing things like writing bills about furries, or writing bills that are, about the bathroom, or any just ridiculous MAGA garbage that really can just sail through at this point with the current, full, lock that the Republican Party has on our state government, with another party in there at a checkpoint. That stuff really doesn't happen anymore. And I would hope that the grown-ups who are in these Republican seats would realize, well, hey, now we're actually going to have to start taking care of our people back home. We're going to have to stay popular with our constituents back home. And so maybe it's time for silly crap to stop and for, actual governing to happen. Let's shift over to the lieutenant governor, which, as Haley said, is, the counterpart to the governor. Our governorship, weaker than some states. And in fact, in Texas, the lieutenant governor is in some ways more powerful than the governor, primarily through the lieutenant governor's control over the Texas Senate. The governor has veto power to stop anything. The lieutenant governor has the power to stop anything, even going through a full half of the legislature in the Texas Senate. So Vicki Goodwin ends up as the lieutenant governor. Even as Kathleen mentioned, if she were the only Democrat to win, just having that one Democrat in place would be a wholesale change in the way things happen in Texas government.
Getting rid of Dan Patrick would be a game changer for Texas.
Sure.
He stands in the way of good public policy. So Texas could, with a new governor and new lieutenant governor, accept Medicaid funds and do Medicaid expansion in Texas, like multiple other Republican majority states like Arkansas or Utah. You can't tell me that Utah and Arkansas are liberal bastions in America. They're not, but those Republican governors know that it's an economic issue to put in $1 and bring $9 home. We're leaving so much money on the table of federal dollars that are not coming back to Texas, that are going all over the country. It makes no sense, except for the Republicans called it Obamacare,
right,
to smear Barack Obama, and people then confused what's the ACA and what's Obamacare. They're the same thing. If you hadn't heard, all these years later, but that is something that could, come through the House and come through the Senate and not have a blocker there that would literally change people's lives. When people are tied to jobs that they don't like because they're tied to their employer's health insurance, or would open up, additional funds for general spending by folks who can't afford their health insurance now. So it would just make such a huge difference to expand Medicaid. It would make a difference on public education. It would make a difference on infrastructure, like you're saying, Haley, about trains and roads. There's so much of a difference that they could even make in their first year. I know that we've mentioned this before, but we're 3 Texans sitting in our respective cities in Texas, and we all know about the good work that Zoran Mamdani has done within 100 days and outside of 100 days. Reduction of crime, early childhood education, public transportation. And he made campaign promises, so are Democratic nominees, and he's delivering. And we know about it because it's remarkable to see what can happen when you have progressive Democrats in office who will then take the power that they were given by the voters and do really good things with it, just like Republicans do terrible things when they have power that really harm our families and public education and healthcare and drive up prices for all of us and make life for our families just that much harder.
2 things that I would point out about Dan Patrick in particular that would see a big change and either a big stop or a big start, depending on which one of these you're talking about. Let's start with the plague of Christian nationalism that we've seen across Texas that has now permeated our schools. We are seeing, the freedom from religion really is central to what I'm talking about here. But really, there's also been a ridiculous clampdown on people of the Muslim faith. This, radical Christianization of our government levels has very much been something that Dan Patrick has very much spearheaded. You may or may not know that there is a new Senate committee about religious freedom, and I'm doing air quotes there, everybody, which really is going to be about how do we cram as much Christian stuff into our legal system and into our schools and everywhere else as we possibly can. Dan Patrick has formed a committee in the in the Texas Senate about that, and also another one under Donald Trump at the federal level. So Dan Patrick himself is spearheading and chairing 2 different committees about pushing Christian stuff into your life, whether or not you want it. At one level, for sure, if Dan Patrick was out of here as a lieutenant governor, I would think that Donald Trump would probably fire him from that other thing at the federal level as well. So that would be an elimination of a person who single-handedly, out of his own personal hubris, has chosen to shove his religion on the rest of Texas and the rest of America. A Vicki Goodwin win would neutralize that. And as far as something that wouldn't stop but would start, Dan Patrick has very much single-handedly stood in the way of any kind of reform when it comes to cannabis. There has been no movement forward. We've had all this stink about, there was a hemp loophole that they, with some bad legislation. Dan Patrick, even got crossways with Governor Abbott about how he was going to crack down on hemp and destroy what had become a multi-billion-dollar industry in Texas with no science to back it up at all. We all remember the press conference where Dan Patrick is throwing packets of pot gummies at the reporters and calling Jeremy Wallace from the Houston Chronicle an idiot, or he called him crazy, called him something anyway. Just being ugly about it and not being thoughtful about it. That is something that's very bipartisan. It actually kind of reminds me of the way things are going with data centers right now. Very much people on both sides of the aisle are not happy with the way the data center thing is going. Let's backtrack and think about the bipartisan nature of the support of a larger degree of freedom for responsible adults in Texas to make use of cannabis products, either recreationally or medicinally or both, or whatever they want to do. We're all grown-ups here. It's well established scientifically that cannabis is much less harmful than alcohol, which is everywhere. Looking at you people in Corpus Christi, everybody be cool in Corpus Christi during the thing. But my point is, Dan Patrick out of the way. I don't particularly know what Vicki Goodwin's position is on legalized marijuana, but I would think that she would probably be a lot more open-minded about it just based on her party. So many changes that could possibly come to pass in this upcoming election in November. I do want to return one more time. That's the most striking thing that came out of this most recent UT and Texas Politics Project poll. Again, was this lopsided leaning of independent voters towards the Democratic side. This election, to me, is going to come down to the turnout for each of the 2 parties' loyalists, and also the turnout, I think even more pivotally, for the God knows how many independent voters are out there. I think there are a lot of them out there. And, speaking of trying to reach independence, anybody out there that you know who might be a lot more interested in cannabis than they are in politics, this is an opportunity to say, hey, did you know that indirectly legal weed is on the ballot? We get rid of Dan Patrick, we pretty much have got a great shot at having legal weed. And so once again, Haley, Haley is a fresh college graduate. I think sometimes, I know when I was going to school, college kids kind of tended to be a little more politically tuned in than other people. I don't know if that's the same thing. Haley, tell us what your impressions of people you've been around and people your age. Haley's in her early 20s. How many of those folks do you think there are in your age group in terms of people who are truly independent who might actually show up and tip this thing one way or the other?
I think it's a lot more than people like to think. Like, in my experience, there are people that are really, really plugged in, and then there are people that are really not plugged in at all.
Yeah.
And I think in my experience, those are the type of people that like to see politics like from an outside perspective. They don't really see politics as something you participate in. It's something you kind of like watch unfold and see what happens. And more often than not, I think that it's not a healthy way to view politics. You do politics, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But in this case in particular, I think just from an outside perspective, if you don't know anything about Texas politics and you look between James Tallarico and Ken Paxton, I think the decision gets maybe a little easier. But that's not to say that they're, the most progressive people. But I think when you just look at politics as things people do, as public figures that have a record that you can look at, yeah, I think in my experience, most of the people I've talked to my age, if they're supporting anybody, it's Tallarico.
Kathleen, as we shut down, tell us your plan to get the independent voters in your orbit to show up to vote coming up in November.
So I'm glad that you brought up cannabis, and I do have some information about how Rep. Goodwin stands on it. She says, let's treat it like alcohol, regulate it, test it, and let veterans use it rather than opioids. And that's because Republicans have chronic back pain issues as well. I mean,
sure.
Public education, cannabis use, these are issues that cross party lines and are really the issues that we should be focusing on about improving people's lives instead of making it harder to live, to work, to thrive. Even talking about thriving right now, it seems a little bit laughable. Life is so hard for people right now, and it's a public policy choice. Earlier, I talked about the billions that we're spending on a different country for a war of choice. That's money that should stay in America, and that Medicaid money is money that we should bring home to Texas. There's so much that we could do by saying, you know what, I've been going along to get along. I've been voting, the way that I grew up. What I'm going to be doing is talking to the independents and Republicans and the base voters in my life of the Democratic Party and making sure that they understand how literally their lives will be different by voting differently in November.
Absolutely. So we will see everyone who is listening to this, who's heading for Corpus Christi at the Texas Democratic Party convention. We will have lots to discuss coming out of the convention in terms of what's said and what's decided upon. Of course, part of the function, we talked about this last week. Largely, the point of the convention is to develop the party platform. We've seen what the Republicans cranked out in Houston a couple of weekends back, and we will have definitely have a compare and contrast session once we have the final Democratic platform in our hands here. Everybody who's traveling to and from Corpus this weekend, please do be safe. And once again, keep the party in check. Let's all be safe and sensible about it. Executive Director Kathleen Thompson and Digital Manager Haley Smith. I am Communications Director Chris Mosier, and that is In Progress. We amplify progressive values, leaders, and actions of Progress Texas while campaigns come and go. We're the permanent home for progressive media and action in the Lone Star State. Radio listeners, if you missed any of our talk today, you're in luck because it will air again this weekend on KPFT Radio in Houston, 90.1 HD2 channel every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Find out more about KPFT at kpft.org and find out more about Progress Texas at progresstexas.org.